Welcome, everyone. My name is Barbara Beerer. I'm the faculty director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center, Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard, and I'm delighted with my colleague, Stephen Sunstein, to welcome you to this webinar, The Global Development of a Clinical Research Workforce, Tools and Resources. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you who are joining us today. Could I have the next slide, please? So we are recording this webinar, and we plan to post the recording for an international audience who obviously can't be up all night. And we will follow up regarding permission with the presenters. If you ask a question in the Q&A, which I suggest that you remember you should be doing, please realize that we will try to get to it, and that will also be public. Next slide, please. This is our common disclaimer. It's only to say that everybody is speaking in their own capacity, although informed, of course, by their institution and responsibilities. The MRCT Center is supported by voluntary contributions and by grants, and that's all disclosed on the website. We are committed to autonomy in our research and our presentations and to transparency in our relationships, and none of us have a personal financial conflict of interest with the content of this presentation. Next slide, please. So before we begin, I just thought I'd mention that the MRCT Center is a research and policy center focusing on the conduct, oversight, ethics, and regulatory environment for clinical trials around the world, and with a real focus on multi-center, multi-site, transnational clinical trials. And we do that work by bringing together representatives of academia, pharma, nonprofit organizations, CROs, patient advocates, regulators, and anyone else who's involved in the question that we're addressing, and then create actionable, workable solutions that we then publish or make available on our website to freely available and for you to use or adapt or adopt. And with the one request to please send us comments and make sure that we know what's helpful and not helpful and how we should move forward. We're also, could I have the next slide, please? This is our vision to improve the safety rigor of clinical trials around the world. And, you know, I just discussed how we involve the community at large, and that's a transnational population. Next slide. So today we're going to be talking about the clinical research workforce. And I have to say that part of the work that we've been doing involves, over the last 15 years or so, the Joint Task Force on Clinical Trial Competencies, of which Stephen Sunstein, who you'll hear from later, and myself are co-chairs. That's a effort that will be described, but basically has tried to identify competencies, domains, and then specific competencies for a complete clinical trial workforce. And it's constantly under development. So at the close of this introduction, we're going to hear from Lembit Rago, who's the Secretary General of CIOMS, who has really contributed enormously through his leadership at CIOMS to address the compelling issues of development of medicines globally, taking on really important areas for discussion. And he's going to talk about education of stakeholders and focusing specifically on health professionals. We are going to hear from Sally Armstrong and PRAXIS Australia. She couldn't be here today, but she and I have reported a global development of a clinical research workforce in the PRAXIS Australia work there. And then Susan Landis, who is here with us today, the Executive Director of ACRP, will talk about the clinical research workforce, and then Stephen will close it up. So with that, let me welcome Lembit and say how excited we are to be hearing from you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Let's then try to get my slides up and start.
I didn't know we were going to do this, but should I do this for a second? The Clinical Trial Competency Workshop is a framework, as I said, was developed for safe, ethical, and high quality clinical research. And it has guidance and tools to ensure necessary competencies. You can see it on the Clinical Trial Competency. The website is available, and we'll make sure you all have these slides later. Could I have the next slide, please? It is developed over the last 11 years, and you'll see that it's now inclusive of leveling with fundamental skills and advanced. It's translated into 12 languages. We have included project management, and we're now working on the inclusion of competencies for patient partners and data management work groups. You can download the framework from the QR code added. Next slide. These are the domains: scientific concepts, research design, ethical and participant safety considerations, medicines development and regulation, clinical trial operations, site management and study management, data management and informatics, leadership and professionalism, and communication and teamwork. And if you click on each of these domains, next slide, you'll see that they're specifically then have a level of competencies, scientific concepts in the design and analysis of clinical trials. I'm not going to read these, but each of these domains has relatively high level, but very useful identified competencies. And could I have the next slide? That are then leveled based on whether you're beginning in this work, you're skilled, you've done this for 2 years or 4 years, or whether you're advanced, see one, do one, teach one. And that's sort of very practical guidance for how to approach making sure that people are competent and, or at least trained and have been exposed to this work. Could I have the next slide? And it's been translated into 12 languages, as I've said, just because people have been using the framework and then wanting to translate it for their own population. If you see your language not here, please get in touch with us and we'll be happy to talk about it. Next slide. So with that, let me introduce Lembit. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. So I'm trying to give you today some higher level thoughts about the product development and need for education of stakeholders with a focus on health professionals. Next one, please. First, couple of words about CIOMS, Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences. We're actually an umbrella organization joining 41 medical science organizations, quite diverse. We have under our umbrella World Medical Association, which joins all the medical doctors around the world, but also some which are more specialized, like International Society of Pharmacovigilance, or some of the medical science academies, like from our host country of Switzerland. But coming to our mission, which is quite short, our mission is to advance public health through guidance on health research, including ethics, medical product development, and safety. This forms our link to the regulatory science and product development. Next one, please. Now, if we go to the product development, it's a life cycle continuum nowadays, and you can't look very much all the stages in isolation. You have to look on the continuum. But let's start from really the basics. To get better medicines, data is what we need. And some people say, in God we trust, all others must bring data. And of course, this means that it is very much the product development is data-centric in many ways. And of course, medicinal product development should be also patient-centric and enabled by well-educated stakeholders. And one could put forward also a data-centric definition for the medical product development, saying that medicinal product scientific development includes all processes and activities necessary to develop and assess data with the aim of bringing the product to the market and supporting its safe and effective use until it stays on the market. Next one, please. Now, of course, it's to a certain extent regulated also to regulatory science, which there is a lot of definitions, but I seem to like most the European Medicines Agency's one. Regulatory science is a range of scientific disciplines that are applied to the quality, safety, and efficacy assessment of medicinal products and that inform regulatory decision-making through the life cycle of a medicine. It also contributes to developing regulatory standards and tools. So next one. So if we look on the product development science and regulatory science, they are very much interrelated and they form the basis. And we have the question now, are all the stakeholders here equally prepared to be active partners and contributors? Next one. Now, if we look and we put the center product development stakeholders, but equally we could put regulatory science, then of course traditionally industry and other sponsors, they are related, they probably know what they do. Researchers, investigators in the industry also very much related, they are educated, systematically prepared. Researchers, investigators outside industry also taken care of. And of course, there is those who assess the data that have been provided. Of course, also industry assesses the data before providing them to the regulators and health technology agencies. They are also taking care of the staff. And then, of course, patients. Yes, until recently they were a bit distant and not so much linked and not so much taken care from the point of view of educating them about the product development. But then there is a bit another group of the people, health professionals, who are working in care delivery, who are not directly involved in the product development. What about them? They are actually a very big army, much bigger army than all the other stakeholders mentioned here. Next one. So, of course, this patient centricity of the product development, there has been a long way and positive way of trying to get the patients on board. And 2022, CIOMS had a very substantive work, patient involvement in the development, regulation, and safe use of medicines, which looked how during the whole life cycle patients could be more effective partners to the product development, which is a life cycle business. So next one, please. But then you come to the more specific parts of the benefit risk balance for medicinal products. It's actually the new CIOMS guidance document that is coming out hopefully in April. And then you can see that patient centricity is built into this new document. Among others, it points out that the relative importance to patients of different attributes of benefit risk, including impact on quality of life or patient perspective of risk, which of medicines identified risks are really patients willing or unwilling to accept. So there is a lot of more nowadays we have when we do specific guidance documents, patient centricity. Next one. But then, what about patients? Are we putting enough effort to educating patients? Again, there has been tremendous progress in some parts of the world. I think some others may lag a bit behind. There is one initiative which is quite well established and well known, the European Patients Academy of Therapeutic Innovation, EUPATI, I think they have done marvelous job to try to promote patient education, but not only to promote, but actually provide also tools and means to educate patients in a more meaningful way. And they have also a lot of materials available in translated forms that others can benefit. Next one. Now we are coming to the question, do health professionals who are in the care delivery know enough about product development? Probably those health professionals who work in the industry. Yes, those who are involved in clinical trials, not directly in the industry, probably yes, again, maybe more narrowly in the domain, but still. But what about those involved in patient care and not involved directly in product development? Well, could we say mostly or most likely not so much? And then if we look, one hot topic of the regulatory science is how real-world data could be best used to generate real-world evidence for safety and efficacy claims. But it's also very much talked about domain today, real-world data, real-world data, real-world data. And then we come, where this real-world data come from? The more we use real-world data, the more health professionals not directly involved in product development start to be involved as they produce and document data in care delivery. So those who were considered and still perceived not to be involved, they start through this real-world data to be linked more and more. Next one, please. So if we look at the real-world evidence importance, it's one slide showing that nowadays we use real-world evidence throughout the whole life cycle of medicines. We use more and more real-world data to produce real-world evidence. But let's leave it here and go to the next slide. Well, this is we are coming now closer. It's about the CIOMS working group that started in April 2021, which is a working group about health professionals' education. And the main objective of this working group was to discuss and develop a consensus report giving recommendations on the principles of competency-based knowledge needed for healthcare professionals working in medicines development. And we have had 9 working group meetings since then, and we are now trying to consolidate the different drafts into one single document with the editorial committee. Next one. So, of course, there is a lot of difficulties on the road, because if you look, even there is not a very good healthcare professional definition that would satisfy the needs of the product development if you put in this context. And I have put here one forward which could be quite close. It is health professionals are those who maintain health in humans through the application of the principles and procedures of evidence-based medicine and caring. Health professionals study, diagnose, treat, and prevent human illness, injury, and other physical and mental impairments in accordance with the needs of the populations they serve. They also conduct research and improve or develop treatments, concept theories, and operational methods to advance evidence-based medicine, healthcare. So that could be quite close to what we need, a definition to put the product development also into the definition. But next one, please. Now, of course, if we look on this is very much a provisional slide. It's nothing set in stone. It's just showing that most likely health professionals don't need the same package of education about the product development, but depending where they work and for which objectives they have on the road, they should have different levels. Of course, those who are mostly connected need most extensive background and education in the product development. They are those who are directly involved in product development in the industry, or product assessment in regulatory and HT authorities. Then you come down a bit, maybe less. Clinical operations teams within pharmaceutical industry, CRO people, Then non-pharma industry health professionals collaborating on pre and post-authorization development, clinical trial investigators and their teams. But then again, on the bottom of the pie, actually, it's the biggest, most numerous part, health professions who are not directly involved with medicine development. And I think they should at least, maybe it's not a correct term, I would not have it, but they need also some very solid, good education for product development nowadays. And whether it's basic or something else is arbitrary. Let's go further to the next slide. Now a bit how the report, because all CIOMS working groups end up with a report, how the report would look like. And of course, there are some obligatory traditional components, but let's go to the content. Next one. Next one is really the report will have 5 chapters. Very important is the background, medicine development landscape. Chapter 2, needs and benefits for education about medicines development. Chapter 3, education strategies and tools a bit shortly. And then comes the, difficult part. Chapter 4, principles of educating health professionals. And chapter 5, principles of educating other interested parties. And then conclusions. So, well, the report really tries to promote the idea that all parties need better education about product development. Next one. Now, of course, if we talk about the health professionals, then we have gone with a division into 5 groups. Group 1, health professionals working in pharma industry. 1A, medical product developers. 1B, clinical operations teams with pharma industry, also CRO people. Group 2, medical product regulators and health technology assessment experts. Group 3, health professionals collaborating on pre and post authorization development, clinical trial investigators and their teams. Group 4, health professional research ethics committees. I think it's worth to point it out as a separate layer, because they need also much more education in product development than sometimes we see in the field happening. And last but not least, and the most maybe controversial, that had a lot of discussions in the group, health professionals involved in patient care and indirectly involved in medical product development. That's also, they need much better, to me at least, and to some of the working group, I think, better education on the modern product development. Let's go further. Next one. So then there are just some extracts from the discussions from the meeting minutes. So what people thought that those who are not directly involved, health professionals, should know, and what should be the competencies. It was pointing out that it's important that they would be knowledgeable in building trust in medicines development, supporting dialogue with patients and caregivers on the treatment, ethical principles of clinical research and definition of study medication. They should be also knowledgeable about the framework of medicines development, also international undertakings to set the standards and the standards themselves, basic regulatory concepts for marketing authorization, very importantly, benefit risk concept, life cycle approach to that, with the individual benefit and risk, because this is also what they should do to do according to the knowledge, the assessment of the benefits and risk for the individual patient. Post-approval safety monitoring and reporting. It was also pointed out the importance of collecting health data, increasing use of real-world data for patient-centered product development, but of course there is traditionally that they have been doing is the spontaneous reporting has been based on the health professionals reporting. Now, next one, please. So the chapter 5, which was also a bit controversial, but we decided it's good to have also, that will be also on a much more higher level, trying to point out that other stakeholders, interested parties who need education in medicine product development: general public, patients, patient experts, patient advocacy group, clinical trial participants. And of course, there could be some good examples taken from the UPATI, and it was decided to have 4 subgroups: general public, patient expert, patient advocacy groups, and clinical trial participants. Next one. Now, the challenge is the report writing. During the discussions, we have actually had a lot of challenges, and there is also challenges with the definitions and scope, how to define the groups of the health professionals, which we now have. The groups also health professionals, how to define them and what to think about and what advice and promote, what type of approaches. So this is all still taking a better shape, but it's also quite clear that, let's say, if you take the medical doctors, to put anything addition to the undergraduate training is not realistic. So it means that we should probably, with the report, promote adding a module on medicinal product development to the specialist training, because if you look several specialties like oncology, cardiology, there's a lot of new drugs. People really need to know much more about the product development, the doctors involved in the daily care that they probably don't have today. And of course, there is the challenge how to convince medical community and education providers about the need to provide more education about the medicinal product development. Next one, please. So the conclusions I would try to have very short. I think there is a need to promote better education about medicinal product development to all product development stakeholders. The report on the development focuses on the educational needs of health professionals depending on the role during product development life cycle. The report is also emphasizing the importance of providing more education, not only for those health professionals who are directly involved in product development, but also to those who are not directly involved. And also the report is going to promote the need of having a module on medicinal product development for medicinal doctors training during the specialist training, and probably some more, but I would leave it here. And now next one, please. Next one is just some of the publications that are available and coming from the CIOMS, which are very much relevant, which is our cornerstone ethical guidelines from 2016, supplemented recently by a needed publication about the international guidelines on the good governance practice for research institutions, but also clinical research in resource-limited settings, which I'm very happy because we were ahead of WHO World Health Assembly resolution. We came out before that, and now the recent WHO publication actually has benefited from our publication. The recommendations, they a lot took from our publication actually. But then there are much more really professional, like organ specifics for the safety, drug-induced liver injury, a very scientific publication, supplemented now, coming out also in April. This year, severe cutaneous adverse reactions, another very hot topic for the drug development. Just to mention some, and then what I mentioned during my presentation, and also just to remind that when you talk about something, it's good always to have a reference to the definitions, and CIOMS is doing Ice Age glossary of Ice Age terms and definitions. Next one. The next one is very simple. Working for public health and patients has a little difficulty. No matter how good we are, we can and should always do better. And I think we should always keep it in mind also when talking about giving education. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a terrific overview of a very complicated area, and I know how much work this current report is. And the one thing I will say about it when it does finally come out, the beauty of it is it's future looking. It is anticipates that so much of our work is going to be done in clinical settings, in research, particularly post-approval. So thank you so much, Lambert. That's great. We're going to move on and save questions to the end to make sure everybody has time to hear the presentation. So why don't you go forward?
That's
There
it.
you go. Go
Yeah,
for it, Steve.
sure.
Okay, you can go to the next slide. Stephen, I'm sorry.
Well, I just wanted to give a couple of words about you, Susan, and introduce you to the group. Susan Landis is the executive director of the Association of Clinical Research Professionals. And ACRP was one of the very early adopters, integrators of the Joint Task Force Core Competency Framework. It was integrated into the actually the functioning of the annual meeting was based upon the framework. The training programs are based upon the framework, and the certification examination is based upon the framework. So Susan has now moved a little more directly into the workforce development activity, and we're really happy to have her with us today and to present some of the efforts that ACRP is now involved in advancing people into the clinical research enterprise. Susan, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Stephen. You can go to the next slide. So I'm happy to be here today. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. ACRP is the Association of Clinical Research Professionals. So we focus on education, we focus on community, and we focus on advocacy. We're nearly 20,000 members at this time globally. And we're very proud of our membership and proud of those who have advanced to certification. Next slide. I thought I would start by making the connection between the JTF and ACRP's training. So we were a part of the original group who helped to establish the JTF, and truly I stand here and others stand here on the backs of that group, especially Beth Harper, who worked with ACRP at the time, and Bridget Gonzalez. And what ACRP did was take the domains and translate them into then frameworks of competencies that are role-based. So we have primary roles, those are CRC, CRA, and PI. And we've modeled them after the way that the domains are modeled, which is entry level, intermediate, and senior. So how do people use these? Well, if you're an individual, these are publicly available on ACRP's website. And if you're an individual, you can come in and say, do I know how to do these things? So you can self-assess as a clinical research professional. But if you're a manager, if you worked at Quintiles like I did, or at the Duke Clinical Research Institute like I did, you might have 300 to 13,000 people in your ClinOps team. And how do you assess that your team members are actually knowledgeable and are actually able to put into practice the competencies based on the domains? And this is what these rubrics or these frameworks allow you to do. And again, they're available on the website. Next slide. So let's talk about the clinical research workforce. It's an important topic. I love that Lembit was talking about the definition of a healthcare professional, because if you go to the next slide, we're all about trying to define what is a clinical research professional, which is difficult to do. So here's what we know today about starting with the workforce in clinical research. We have more trials. We have more complex trials. We don't have enough people to do those trials. We know that there is not a standard path into the career. And in fact, most people report that they fell into the career. And we know that the definition of the role, CRC, CRA, is probably defined by where you work, not necessarily a globally recognized standard of the role. And then we also know there's no mandate for certification. So certification is the mark of knowing that you can apply your knowledge. Next slide. So a group of people got together and we created the Partners Advancing the Clinical Research Consortium. This was prior to me joining ACRP, probably 2019, 2020. We had really a simple vision, which is, can we increase awareness of the profession? Can we drive collaboration among people like Lembit and others who are on this call who really understand we have a crisis in the workforce? Can we get competencies across the board recognized and use those competencies in everything that we do, from teaching to hiring to advancement? And can we build pipelines between educational institutions and employers? Next slide. So I like to say we're a small but mighty team. I will tell you that the people here are actively involved in change. They are change agents when it comes to workforce development. I give a shout out to Duke in this area. And some of the people here are just aware and committed to changing how it's done today. We also have the FDA on our consortium, the NIH, and then some global representation as well. Next slide. So our priorities are build an identity for the clinical research workforce, change how we hire, and open doors to a new career. And those priorities obviously map back to the vision. Next slide. So we started out simply, which is we developed a toolkit that essentially answered the question, what is clinical research? Because if you're thinking about getting into it, you most likely don't have any idea what it really is. And so we created a toolkit called Ready, Set Clinical Research. Again, available on our website. The first paper we wrote outlines the issues in the workforce, but it also importantly outlines the barriers. And one of those barriers is not only people not knowing about the workforce, but also this idea that is pervasive that you have to have at least 2 years of experience to enter the workforce, which is leaving a lot of people on the side of not even being able to enter. Next slide. We also developed a piece called Now is the Time to Fix the Clinical Research Workforce. And we built this upon a piece that Dr. Califf did, where he argued that data was the engine of clinical research. And we came back and said that the clinical research workforce is the engine of the drug development process. And we feel very passionate about that. So members of our partners group, our partners consortium, came together to, in an evidence-based fashion, lay out the crisis that we have in the workforce today. Next slide. We also just recently built upon the first paper in a call for collective action for the industry to come together to work on this workforce crisis. We have 6 domains that we have identified: awareness, representation, standardization, harmonization, a pathway, and building an identity. All of this is available on ACRP's website. Next slide. And we've done a little bit of work on a skill set based approach. And what I wanted to call your attention to is when we went in and we surveyed what are the most required skills and abilities for a clinical research or somebody interested in entering this career. You can see on the left-hand side what they are: attention to detail, communication, committed to confidentiality and privacy. Shockingly, and I'll say that personally, you can see the ones that least required on the right-hand side. And one of those is working with data. So some of you may have a lot of opinion about that, especially where we're headed in clinical research. But what I want you to know is that you first have to start with a real skill set that is based on judgment and detail and project management. And then you can learn the data as you go on. Next slide. So Stephen asked me to talk about our response to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So here, if you take anything away from this today, here's the one thing to take away. The clinical research occupation is not recognized at the federal level in the United States as a profession. That means a lot of things. First and foremost, it means that we don't track data, and we know that data is important. So ACRP responded, if you go to the next slide, the Bureau of Labor Statistics opened up its standard occupational classification review in June of this year. ACRP responded with a document that requested, when you respond, you request a change to an occupation, a revision to an occupation, an addition to an occupation, and you can request the establishment of an occupation. Currently, there is one role, CRC, and it is tucked into the category of life sciences. And we argued in this response that we should have multiple roles and that it should be put into the healthcare category, not life sciences. So this is a document that is chock full of data and information about the clinical research workforce, about its contribution to healthcare, and about all of us who work in it. And it has roles, it has definitions, and it has data about our contribution at the economic level as well. For those of you who want to see it, I put a QR code here, and that will link you to our website that allows you to download the document. The BLS opens review of this document every 10 years, and it takes 4 years to review the responses. So we will not hear anything about this until 2028. Next slide. So why do we need an occupation code? We need an occupation code because, like the nursing associations or the multiple nursing associations today, we need an occupation code to be able to raise visibility for the profession. We need to be able to define the profession. We need to address workforce gaps. We need to justify an investment in academia, training, policy for the profession. And we need to reinforce the value that clinical research professionals contribute today. Next slide. So the second thing that ACRP is doing is we're actually going to conduct a workforce survey. There's not one that exists today. So we are working with the Fitzhugh Mullen Institute for Health Workforce Equity, and we are going to conduct a workforce survey as a toe in the water as phase 1 to try to put data around the clinical research workforce. We're going to identify where professionals are needed. We want to support training programs, and we obviously want to highlight workforce diversity because we know representation in the workforce directly leads to a more representative patient population. Our first step is phase 1, which is to work on focus groups talking about what should be in the survey. Next slide. So the focus group design, career pathways and training, workforce challenges, pay, that has been a controversial discussion, whether or not we should address that, recruitment strategies, and industry needs and workforce planning. Next slide. For those people who work in the profession, we're going to ask questions in our focus group like, how did you get here? What does a typical day look like? What are your opportunities? And what are your biggest issues? Next slide. For employers and supervisors in our focus groups, we're going to say, what roles are critical? How do you recruit and retain? Is there a clear ladder in your organization? And what data would be useful for you? Next slide. So in addition to those areas, ACRP directly supports the workforce through scholarships. Each year, we give tuition scholarships for those who are in academia, training to be clinical research professionals, And we give education grants to our conference, which is coming up at the end of April in New Orleans. And we do this through a cycling effort that our members do. And so far, we've raised $250,000. So we're really proud of the fact that based on our consortium and based on our fundraising, we're able to actually directly support the workforce in the industry. Next slide. And finally, we put into the field in December of last year, prior to the administration, a workforce survey that hopes to capture the voices of clinical research professionals, which is really important to ACRP. And the results of that survey, we had over 700 completed responses. The results of that survey will be distributed at our conference in late April. And you can see the juxtaposition of some of the results that we have received so far. Next slide. And that's it. I want to thank everybody and especially thank MRCT and the JTF for having ACRP.
So thank you so much, Susan. That was great. And I really think it's so important that we are fully inclusive as you're doing your best effort to be so, to include those people who can afford the kind of training that you offer. But you know, it's a wonderful program and very comprehensive. Why don't you go forward with Sally's?
Welcome. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Sally Armstrong, who is the CEO of PRAXIS Australia. Sally actually did us the favor of recording this before we had this meeting today because it is whatever, a 12, 14-hour difference. Is that right?
Yes.
And we really wanted Sally to come today, as PRAXIS Australia is one of the first institutions internationally that really adopted the JTF, used it in order to build the training program, but took it way beyond the standard setting to really think about how to engage the workforce in a future vision of a collaborative nature. And I want to introduce Sally and then ask you if you could take us through a bit of that journey. Over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you for this opportunity to be involved in this really important webinar. A little bit about PRAXIS to start off with, just to give a little bit of context for who we are and what we do. We have been operating for over a decade, and in that time have supported over 1,500 in the clinical trials and research ethics sectors. We have been involved in collaborating, and initially this started with MRCT all those years ago, back in 2015 when we began, and we were looking for a robust framework to underpin the courses that we had and were offering to the sector. And so our first offer essentially was a series of modules for the sector, designed with our specialist and expert researchers. And they were stackable modules, 2 to 3 hours in duration, that could be done very easily by people working in the sector. And underpinning the development of each of those modules, and we had over 40, was the JTF framework. So it essentially was with us since the beginning of our offer, and over the 10 years has evolved into all of our programs. So currently what we offer is a range of modules, as mentioned. We also offer virtual and bespoke workshops to the sector and bespoke solutions, which we collaborate with providers nationally and internationally, government and private sector, to design these training solutions. So it's a very collaborative approach. All of these offers are underpinned by the JTF. So let me talk about some of those specific programs that we've been involved in, which are some of the bigger collaborative ones. The first is the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework and how we have supported the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare to roll out training for assessors involved in the development of that framework nationally. So essentially, we worked with the Commission to develop 4 modules, and those were made available in 2023 and rolled out across the sector. So that was a terrific program. We've also worked with Health New Zealand more recently on their clinical trials reform across the nation. And with that, we were involved in co-developing in partnership with Health New Zealand 2 courses, each consisting of about 8 different modules. For that, we used our existing clinical trial modules, and we worked very, very closely with Health New Zealand to ensure that those modules were culturally and, from a regulatory perspective, relevant to the New Zealand market. So we used a lot of their expert writers and a lot of the Health New Zealand clinical trial experts to collaborate to build those modules. We've just launched that project, and the uptake has been very, very swift for that. So we're very excited about that. That was a unique program because the Maori perspective was so important to get right in the offer of these modules. So that was a really key element of that program. And that is continuing. And additional to that, we have our immersive program offers, which are key offers in terms of our workforce development. And essentially, those programs began in 2022 when we delivered a program for MTP Connect, which is a government-funded program, essentially to upskill the clinical trial sector and to help reduce the gap, the skills gap in the sector. So we worked with MTP Connect and a consortia of 7 different providers across academia, industry, government, nationally, to develop a program that was an on-site immersive training program to upskill clinical trial coordinators. And that was the first of our immersive programs. It was a very small program. We had 15 in the program initially. We wanted to keep it small to ensure that we were continuously able to assess that, redevelop, and get it right. And we did that across 3 states. So South Australia, New South Wales, and Queensland. And that was really the beginning of our immersive program offer. When that program was complete, we then moved on to offer a program for Prospect, which was run by Dizer and Omico. And that was to support the precision oncology screening program that was being rolled out by Omico, and to really help train and develop people working in oncology clinical trial sites across the country. So that was a program that was a 5-month program, and we delivered that to 40 clinical trial coordinators who were placed in sites nationally across Australia, including a very important part of that was the inclusion of the regional, rural, and remote sites across Australia. So essentially, those are some of our program offers, all of those underpinned by JTF. And certainly, I think, a key part of our winning initially the government grant for the MTP Connect program, which is our first pilot program, was the fact that we based this on a very sound international best practice framework, which was the JTF. So that was really critical in the development of that program, and has been in the offer of the private version of the program that we are currently rolling out. So a little bit more about those specific programs, which you can see the differences. We started initially with a much longer program, which went for 10 months. when we evaluated and built on that, a smaller program was what we landed on for our offer to support the Prospect program. And then from that, we have moved to a much shorter 3-month program, which is offered nationally. And that is essentially a user-funded program. So this is a program that people who are wanting to enter the clinical trial sector, or people who may have worked in the clinical trial sector already previously, but have taken a gap and they're just wanting to very quickly uplift and upskill. So that's a 3-month program. And just going on, some of the benefits of that program we are seeing not only to the participants, but certainly to the sites and to the teams that those participants are working in. So it's a very, very effective, efficient program that rapidly upskills participants and gives them the benefit of doing essentially what are our most popular clinical trial modules and workshops, but ensuring that those are delivered in real time so that participants can apply the learnings while they are on site. So there's a workplace component and a training component to those programs. A key part of that program in terms of the workforce development benefits are to participants, the site mentors, and also to the sites. We have a 3-tiered mentoring framework that is a really pivotal part of this program. So that involves the site mentor to the participant mentoring relationship, and that's a 2-way mentoring relationship where the learnings go both ways. We also link all of the program participants into their peer mentoring group, as well as the mentors across sites into a peer mentoring group. So it's a very robust mentoring framework that really helps to accelerate the learnings and support participants as they are undergoing their on-site training. Some of the benefits we're seeing across the sector are really encouraging. So we're seeing this is certainly helping to stem the clinical trial skill gap, albeit in a very small population sample. We're certainly seeing that this is helping to build the confidence and capability of not only the participants involved in the program, but also the broader clinical trial site teams and their mentoring site mentors. So, there's a really important workforce development happening across the leadership skills development. Career pathways into the sector, which is a really important element of the program. So we're seeing a high level of employment into the sector by participants either getting roles at the site they have been placed in or at another alternate clinical trials site. So that's really encouraging. And a really important element is the inclusion of our regional, rural, and remote site staff, and particularly our First Nations people who we are certainly encouraging and incorporating into this program. And that's a really important gap that we're trying to fill. So where to from here? We're increasingly starting to partner with organizations not only in Australia, but internationally, and certainly looking to grow those collaborations, helping to develop programs like the immersive program I've been talking about, but also tailored programs specifically for particular workforce needs. So whether it is induction, staff retention, building a global workforce, organizations are using our modules and workshop solutions to really help with those critical workforce development needs. And all of this, of course, wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't started with our terrific relationship with MRCT and the JTF. It's certainly been a very important part of our programs and a framework that underpins everything that we do. I think that's really all I wanted to say, Barbara.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Sally. That was really just a perfect introduction to what you've been doing in Australia. I wanted to ask a couple of questions if you have time.
Of course.
One of which is you talked about this immersive program. I presume that means that each group starts at the same time and continues through as a cohort, as it were, but it's virtual in terms of the training and the interactions. And then each person also has their on-site development and mentor. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Where we can, that's exactly right, Barbara. So we're working with the programs that I mentioned with MTP Connect, with the OMICO Prospect program. We worked with particular cohorts starting at the same time so that they were a discrete group, and there was that community of practice built around the cohort. So that's certainly how those programs operated. The training that we provided, the live virtual workshops and the online modules, those were accessed virtually. However, we did at the start and the end of the program bring participants together. And part of the end of program, a really key part is the presentation of the learnings from the participants and then the feedback from the mentors. And where possible, we try and do that live as a group. And sometimes we use a hybrid model. So, for example, we get a group together in South Australia and they would be present in the room together. And we then may bring in another state who are present in a room together. These are the wonders of a hybrid workforce. So we're using a number of different models for that. For the shorter program, the privately available to individuals, that's the 3-month program, the Progress program that we are now offering. That doesn't involve a cohort starting at the same time. So we run that program a bit differently.
So interesting. So this is also very, I would think, helpful in terms of retention because people have a group that they're part of. So they end up, sort of knowing each other across different settings. Is that a true statement or just a hypothesis?
No, that's absolutely right. And in fact, when we've evaluated the programs, that has come out as one of the key, most valued benefits is becoming part of a network so that participants are supported in their learning journey. They're supported as they start to work in a clinical trial site. And also their mentors are supported.
Right. So you mentioned when you did an assessment of gaps. How do you do that across a country?
So that's I guess, a cumulative assessment. So when we've looked at gaps in developing our programs, we do a voice of customer survey annually. And in that, we ask about the specific needs and the training gaps. Additional to that is the information that we have from the organizations, the sites that we're working with, who clearly identify the gaps up front when we come in to work with them to develop a training solution.
Terrific. And let me ask, if it's okay, one last question, which is that you said that you, I think, adapt the modules to the specific needs of the group that you're about to train. How different are the training? How much do you have to adapt for both the regulatory environment, number one, and two, the cultural considerations?
Yeah, that's a really important consideration, Barbara. And I think particularly depending on who we are adapting for. So, for example, when we work with an organization for their workforce, obviously we're looking at the priority organizational staff development needs within that organization. And we don't need to adapt the modules much at all. Effectively, we're adapting perhaps the delivery of certain workshops to meet those needs.
Well, let me just thank you so much for this really wonderful presentation that you've given us, and a real sense of how you envision, adapting and using the JTF and then making it your own, which is exactly what we had hoped when we started over a decade ago, I think. And it's been a journey. And let me just say, from the Harvard MRCT side of it, as well as from the JTF side, we've really appreciated the long-term collaboration and the support of Praxis Australia.
I know that people will have to leave, but I wonder if there's one or two questions from the Q&A that you want to ask, Steve, if people still have time. Susan,
Yeah,
there's a request for your email in the chat. Okay.
Yeah, be more than happy to do that. I first wanted to say thank you to Lembit and to Susan and to Sally for all the efforts that you've expressed here. And I think it's really important to realize how the concept of competencies has been integrated into the activities of the clinical research enterprise, and how international this effort is. If there are questions, be more than happy to answer.
There are some in the Q&A if you want.
In the Q&A?
Should I read them? Yeah.
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Sure. So this is to you, Lembit. While CIOMS provides essential ethical guidelines for research involving human participants, these guidelines are not legally binding, and their implementation often depends on national regulatory frameworks. What steps are being taken to ensure that ethical recommendations are effectively enforced in LMICs where regulatory oversight is often limited?
You're on mute, Lembit.
Yeah.
Sorry for that. So thank you for the questions. It's a good question, but there is probably not so good answer. Now, the CIOMS guidelines basically are hand in hand with the World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki. Our guidance is in contrast to the World Medical Association, which has only high-level principles. Our guidance is giving more explanations and background that is useful for the implementation. So this is already what we have tried to do. But of course, as is with the World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki, is also per se not mandatory. Now, in low and middle income countries, it's also the player who is there active is also the WHO, who is doing quite a bit of a job, also trying to strengthen the ethical supervision and to do some trainings. And this part of WHO is quite active. Now, recently, together with the other part of the WHO, which is more involved in the regulatory business, they have included also in the regulatory, similarly to the regulatory benchmarking, developed a module to do the benchmarking of ethics committees and to try to assess them. And I think this has been actually, I recommended this approach quite some years ago, and that has been quite successful because making it linked to the regulatory activities has been putting the countries sometimes more moving than just going there as purely ethical, considerations and things like that. So there is, I think, positive trend of movement into closing the gaps, but of course there is still probably quite a lot to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And another question is, how have there tends to be an emphasis on clinical research professionals in clinical trials, but we know there's a need for professionals and others beyond support roles for the clinical trials conduct. How are you addressing that? Susan, do you want to take that?
Say it again, Barbara.
Sure. There's been an emphasis on clinical research professionals in clinical trials, but we know there's a need for professional support beyond and others for clinical trial support. How have you been addressing that? I think you spoke to it, that you're very inclusive in your training, and it's based on the role rather than the title.
I actually might go back to Dr. Lembit's his design that he showed, which is the amount of people who are involved in needing to support clinical trials and the different roles that they have, right? And so the training goes from, as he said, basic all the way up to advanced, right? And so that's for a healthcare professional. It also is, in some sense, also a model for specific training for people who are involved in the drug development process. It may not just be a clinical trial, but it also may be real world evidence, right? It may be on the other side of it. And so that foundational training that needs to occur, which ties back to the JTF, is important. But then there's an entire supportive areas of training that has to be there as well. Patient engagement, patient centricity being one of those.
Thank you. You know, Lembit, I just have to say one thing about whether or not we should continue to push to put, the drug development methods and logic and sort of tools back into medical education. Right now, we still have courses that go on for weeks in pharmacology. And every medical student will be using AI to design the drugs. They won't be even designing drugs. They'll be using drugs. And they know more about like what a carbon ring looks like than they know about a side effect or an adverse event. And I personally think the emphasis is still sort of a 19th century history lesson in some of these. So you may feel differently, but I think we should continue to bear the torch, that we should be looking forward and challenging how we're spending certain time.
I agree on that, but it's really difficult to get it through.
I know.
There is a lot of resistance, because truly undergraduate training in medical schools, I have been teaching in medical school. I teach clinical pharmacology. I know it very well.
Oops.
But if you can put slightly more modern approach to the pharmacology and clinical pharmacology. But it's also nowadays, how we teach students in medical schools has also put some limits, because there is a lot of more problem-based teaching.
Solving, yeah.
And problem-based teaching or problem-solving teaching doesn't necessarily help to give people more broad background or some specific knowledge that may not be, because there is competition for the time. Now, if you go to the postgraduate training of specialists, and most of the medical doctors working are specialists in a way, they are cardiologists or oncologists, neurologists. You can also have the general practitioners as a profession. You have also postgraduate training for that. In postgraduate training, there is just, for me, a bit more realistic opportunities to press certain modules in, due to the time constraints. But even there, it is difficult. But I agree that it would be also good to try to challenge the people how they teach pharmacology and clinical pharmacology. I was a bit unusual because I teach in clinical pharmacology GCP, Some said, why do you do that, you know? At least basic principles. They said, it's not your mandate. But I said, who else is then doing it? Because there is nobody who will do that. And also some ethics as well. Very what I could. And of course, it came on the price of that maybe I couldn't give some other things, you know. So it's a bit balancing. And I think sometimes we do the balancing really wrong because we try to give to the medical students some sort of a detailed knowledge which is out of date, you know, after they get to the field, you know, instead of giving them more some high level principles how they could tune themselves and be running with the time, you know. We teach them actually how to not run with the time, that we teach them how to be, you know, static. But we should really have this concept of how to give them the knowledge that they would pick up the right things, but you have to create the basis for that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I didn't mean to insult clinical pharmacology.
Well,
Steve?
they are still closest, you know, what we want to do in many ways, but that's it.
Yeah. Steve?
Yeah, I just a general question that I'm curious, Lembit, as to whether or not some of the workforce issues that Susan has brought up are as relevant in Europe as they are in the United States.
I think they are, because it's again, there is a lot of gray areas and you know, recognition as a profession in some settings gives certain advantages. And people are trying, of course, to achieve that, but it's not really easy. Well, again, I know clinical pharmacology a bit because in Europe there was a fight to have the clinical pharmacology as a medical profession recognized, and it was not very easy to have it. So it took a huge amount of time because in some countries historically it was, in others it was not. And then if you achieve certain level of the member states in EU recognizing something, then you can press it saying the majority recognizes, and you have it then on the European Union level also. So there is difficulty is that in the EU context, the European Union context, these type of things are national mandate. They are not really commission mandate. So this is also making, you know, it more difficult. Medicine's regulation is fortunately commission mandate, so you can have there one, you know, rule and one set of principles and, you know, one aspiration.
Well, again, I'd like to thank everyone else, and I think we've gone over a bit in our time frame. So thank you all for joining all over the world. We have over almost 200 people who registered for this. So thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll do this again.